One hot evening in September 2021, a quiet rural village in Northumbria was shaken to the core by arguably one of the most horrific events the county had ever seen. This is an account from the boy who lived it. I remember it was a really warm summer's evening. I'd been fucking about in the woods with my mate. We'd been making explosives, do you know? Actually, it doesn't matter. So I got home. I remember I went straight to my room to feed Nelson, my pet tarantula, because I hadn't fed him for a while. But almost as soon as I closed my bedroom door, I heard this massive crash. A couple of seconds later, I could hear this fucking awful screaming. It sounded like a dying animal. I rushed downstairs to see what it was. I ran into the front room. A thick cloud of dust made it almost impossible to see anything. All I could see was the front half of a black pickup truck which had smashed into our front room. I looked down, and wedged between the truck and the wall was a young woman. One of her legs was completely severed. Her other leg prevented her from freeing herself. She called out for me to help her, but before I could get to her, I was thrown back across the room by what felt like a hot blast of air. I dragged myself to my knees and crawled back across the room. Bearing in mind the room was now filled with black smoke. The screaming had stopped. All I could hear was a high-pitched ringing. I managed to get to the front door and into the fresh air. I lay motionless for a couple of seconds, and then I heard some radio chatter. I opened my eyes and saw a police officer walking away from the house. He clearly hadn't seen me, but just as I was about to call out for help, I heard him saying to his radio, "It's done, that junkie whore is dead." I think I must have passed out, because the next thing I remember is it was dark, but it was still fairly warm. Within seconds of opening my eyes, my thoughts were drawn to what the police officer had said. I managed to get to my feet. I decided to go for a walk to mull everything over in my head. The more I walked, the more I kept thinking about how corrupt the police were and how this officer was going to get away with murder. I had made my mind up. This ends tonight. I quickly made my way into the woods where me and my mate had a small weapons cache. I took my crossbow along with a few bolts, the homemade napalm we made earlier that day, and lastly my pocket knife. The local neighbourhood police officer was no more than 10-minute walk away. When I arrived, I climbed onto the little roof above the front door of the office. I then threw a small rock at the shitty little patrol car to trigger its alarm. I waited a few seconds, and then right on cue, I heard the door opening. The second the officer stepped outside, I poured the napalm over him, quickly followed by a lit piece of cardboard. Then woof! Up he went in flames. His blood-curdling screams filled the warm night's air. I then leapt down from the roof and made my way into the reception room. Being quiet was no longer necessary, as the screaming from outside gave me perfect cover. I could hear another officer sprinting down the hallway. The second the door flung open, I leapt onto him, plunging my pocket knife into his neck. Before I could finish him off, I heard yet more heavy footsteps sprinting down the corridor. How many of these fuckers are there, I wondered. I took my crossbow from over my shoulder, knelt on one knee and took aim. Again the door flung open, and I fired. Within a second the officer was lay motionless on the floor. My bolt had gone straight through his head. Now by this point the noise had somewhat died off. The officers were all but dead. And so I decided to do a quick sweep of the building before lighting it up. I checked all the rooms but found nobody else. I prepared my Molotov from some spare fuel I'd acquired and an empty bottle. Just as I was about to light it, I heard this whimpering coming from the storage cupboard. I readied my crossbow and flung open the door. And there he was, curled up in the corner of the cupboard, whimpering and moaning. PC Hussar, the corrupt officer who had murdered the innocent woman, and was now in front of me, whimpering like a pathetic mess. I readied my crossbow and took aim, but then I thought, nah, let's make him really pay. I proceeded to ask him if he had pressed his panic button, to which he told me he had. Okie dokie, I replied to him. Strangely, he then asked me to hear him out. I wasn't going to play these silly games with him, and so I grabbed him by the collar and dragged him outside. I asked him to give me the keys to his car, which he did. All the time he was asking me what I was going to do with him, to which I replied, "Silence, Hussar. All good things come to those who wait." I then took his kosh from his utility belt and broke both his legs so he could not get away. I positioned him so that his arms and legs were straight as possible, with his head facing towards the police station. I went back to the car and put it in neutral, so the slight downhill would let it roll slowly. By now Hussar had worked out what was happening and had become very frantic. He rolled himself over and tried to claw at the tarmac in a desperate attempt to escape his fate. And then crunch, the car had reached him. It started at his legs and slowly rolled its way up him. Crunch, 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 and then pop. The build-up of pressure had caused his head to burst like a watermelon. I stood back to take a minute, and the next thing I know, I was here in the hospital. And that is all we have of his story. Stephen Carter died of a heart attack before he could finish his account of what happened. But what I can tell you is that there was never a woman killed by a pickup truck. You see, Stephen was a paranoid schizophrenic in a secure psychiatric hospital, and the evening in question he had managed to escape. However, 4 police officers were killed that night, including PC Hussar. We think that Stephen had heard about PC Hussar on the news, as he was under investigation for racial profiling, and we believe that this is what led to Stephen carrying out this brutal attack. Unfortunately, we will never get to hear his full account.